Have you had that strange feeling of having lived something before? An unknown place that seems familiar, a talent that simply is born with you, or even in without explanation fear? Yeah. What if I told you that these clues can be more than coincidence? What can be fragments of your memory of the soul's subtle evidence you've been here before? It turns out that for a long time, ancient doctrines taught that the soul was an eternal traveler, learning and evolving through multiple existences. Only this knowledge disappeared, or rather it was erased, censored, manipulated, because a person who understands his true nature, his soul sovereignty, does not be so easy for rules created by men. And here comes the mystery. Why was the idea of reincarnation, present in so many ancestral traditions, was scratched from the sacred pages of Christianity? In this video, we will dive deep into an engaging and almost prohibited theme. Let's explore the Nicaea Council to search lost texts, reveal the strategies behind religious censorship, and understand how the spiritual control system was devised with surgical accuracy. Do not expect ready answers. Expect questions that will blow up your mind and maybe wake up something that has always been there, just waiting to be remembered. Is it not curious to think that reincarnation, an idea present in so many cultures from Egypt to India, from Celts to Mayans, simply disappeared from the center of the Christian faith? It was not a lack of evidence, nor doctrinal error. What happened was a silent but effective operation of institutional manipulation. The religious elite of the time realized something dangerous. Who understands that he will return to life, which is on the journey, begins to question rules made to control and not to release. Then, panic hit the sacred palaces. Imagine a soul that knows it is eternal, that does not fear hell, nor is it selling for promises of salvation in exchange for blind obedience. This soul becomes ungovernable. And that, my friend, is the real threat. The erasure of the memory of the soul was not by chance. It was strategy. The idea of primitive Christianity with a free soul, connected to the divine by essence, needed to be changed by a model of submission. Thus was born the spiritual control system that still haunts many people today. But the most curious thing is that, even with such strength behind this spiritual extortion, the truth survived. In lost texts, in legends whispered by generations, in practices of spiritual journey that never totally erased. And when we start looking at these fragments carefully, everything changes. The puzzle begins to assemble, and what was once only blind faith becomes a conscious search for who we really are. Most people grow up believing that the soul is born along with the body, as if it were a divine gift delivered into a box at birth. But what if it is the opposite? What if the soul had been around here for millennia, jumping with body to body, learning, making mistakes, evolving? The idea of reincarnation invites us to see existence with other eyes, not as a single return race, but as a long learning journey, where each life is a different class. When we understand this, something powerful happens. We feel we have time, not to procrastinate, but to live with more awareness. The error is no longer eternal condemnation and becomes part of the process. What's more, we realize that we carry the soul's memory within us, with past lives that explain our fears, talents, and even meetings. This view releases. It takes the weight of either you get it right or condemned, and returns the soul's sovereignty, which is your divine right to experiment, grow, and awaken. This is why this knowledge scares so many people in a position of power. Because a person who knows that the soul is an eternal traveler begins to ask questions. It begins to distrust the spiritual control imposed by moved doctrines. It begins to seek inside, not outside, its own way of salvation. And then, the whole castle of fear and guilt begins to crumble. After all, those who have direct access to the divine do not need intermediaries, nor threats of eternal condemnation. Few people know, but the exclusion of the reincarnation of Christian teachings was not a theological issue. It was political. That's right. For centuries, religious leaders realized that this idea gave too much power to the individual. Imagine millions of people understanding that they do not need a clergy to connect with God, that their eternal soul already comes with an internal growth manual. Chaos for those who wanted an obedient flock. Solution: religious censorship of the heavy. In the Council of Nicaea, and in so many other encounters throughout history, It was decided what was divine word and what was heresy. Texts that talked about past lives were left out, burned, or rewritten. Philosophers such as Origen, who openly defended the pre-existence of the soul and its learning cycles, were silent, literally deleted from history. The message was clear: thinking differently was dangerous, and spreading that thought. Even more so, this erasing process was not done with open debates, but with fire, persecution, and a lot of fear. Imagine the impact of this. Whole generations grew up believing in a filtered version of spirituality, a version made to keep faith in walls under surveillance. But the echo of truth continues, whispering in fragments, in lost texts, in traditions that escaped the fire. Those who hear with their hearts realize there is something they tried to hide, but they could not completely erase. Do you know that saying the winners write the story? In the case of spirituality, they also rewritten. Figures like Origen, who defended revolutionary ideas such as reincarnation and the eternity of the soul, were silenced, not because they were wrong, but because they threatened the system. The logic was simple: if the soul is free and eternal, it does not need institutions to be saved. And it hits the faith model that was sold for centuries: faith with label, price, and dogma. The most cruel is that many of these thinkers were canonized as heretics only after being killed. That's right. Origen, for example, was very respected in his day, but later he was accused of heresy conveniently, when his ideas were already planted in the popular imagination. The strategy was to erase its influence as it still gave time. And so, with a decree here and another there, a new narrative was created, one where the eternal soul was dependent on blessings of others to continue to exist in peace. But words have their own life. The ideas of spiritual freedom that these thinkers spread continue to play hearts to this day, and you can access them. Look for books on Origen's thinking, such as Principles, or explore Gnostic texts that have escaped censorship. Reading may seem dense at first, but it is worth every page. It's like opening a window to a world where spirituality is neither fear nor punishment, but a path that has always been there, within you. Sometimes the silence of the story is not only from omissions in the books, but from the stuffed scream for violence. This is what happened to Hypatia, one of the greatest minds in the ancient world. Philosopher, mathematics, and master of spirituality, she taught about reincarnation and soul cycles long before it was considered dangerous. Only its brightness bothered. A woman, free-thinking, teaching that the soul was sovereign, a direct threat to the control system that was beginning to consolidate. Hypatia was not just discredited, she was brutally murdered by a crowd incited by religious fanaticism. His death was more than a tragedy, it was a warning. He showed how far the authorities were willing to silence who defended the memory of the soul and spiritual autonomy. The body has been destroyed, but its ideas, they keep echoing. And it shows something powerful: even the fire, the stone, or the blade are not a way to the truth when it has germinated in other souls. If you want to know more about Hypatia and your spiritual vision, look for the movie Agora 2009, a beautiful work that portrays your life. Or read about the Library of Alexandria, where many of the lost texts were kept and were destroyed with it. Hypatia represents all those who dared to teach that the soul is free, that faith does not impose itself with fear, but discover itself with courage, and that spiritual awakening is a personal journey, not a sentence controlled by dogmas. Now it starts to get even deeper. The Gnostics, an extremely old spiritual group, did not see reincarnation as a divine gift, but as a subtle prison. For them, the soul was stuck in a cycle controlled by a misleading entity called Demiurge, a false god, creator of the material world, who used the Renaissance as a trap to keep consciousness attached to suffering. Strong, right? But it makes sense when you look at the world and feel that something is wrong. These Gnostics taught that true salvation came from knowledge gnosis. It was not by rituals or blind obedience, but for awakening the sovereignty of the soul. They had practices of spiritual journey, fasting, meditation, and internal revelations that allowed the soul to escape the imposed cycle. Reincarnation in this context was not evolution, it was spiritual extortion. A way of keeping the soul turning forever in a carousel that it has not chosen, always forgetting who it is really. Unfortunately, not by chance, the Gnostic texts were censored, their persecuted followers, and their taxed teachings of heresy. But some of these writings survived, such as those found in Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Works such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Felipe bring coded messages about the inner awakening and the illusion of the material world. Reading these texts is like finding a letter sent by someone who discovered the departure of the maze and left the map for those who want to follow. Did you know that not all the Gospels ended up in the Bible? Many were rejected, hidden, or simply destroyed because they did not align with what religious power wanted to maintain. Among these lost texts, some such as the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip contain surprising messages, with veiled references to reincarnation, sovereignty of the soul, and even the illusion of the physical world. They do not deny Christ, but they have a totally different view of what was imposed on the official primitive Christianity. These texts do not speak of eternal condemnation, but of awakening. They suggest that the soul came into the world many times, forgetting who it is, with each passage a process of spiritual forgetfulness that can only be expired with conscience. Jesus himself, in these alternative gospels, appears as a guide into himself, not as a rules collector. It is a revolutionary view spirituality without fear, without institutional control, where the path is discovered, not dictated. And the most fascinating, these documents were almost erased from history, but they resurfaced in the 20th century, as if they had expected the right time to speak to humanity again. If you have never read the Gospel of Thomas, it is very worthwhile. He is short, straightforward, and, in many excerpts, closer to a spiritual conversation than a sermon. By accessing these forgotten truths, we are rebuilding something greater, a puzzle of the soul, where each piece rescued brings us closer to our eternal purpose. When the idea of reincarnation was taken from the Christian doctrine, something much greater than a simple concept was lost. In her place, a rigid, binary, and frightening model came in: a life, a judgment, an eternal destiny. This system is the height of spiritual control. If you only have one chance and you can burn forever in hell, any slip turns panic. And in this panic, many people become easily manipulable, afraid of the spiritual extortion sheltered of salvation. This fear generates dependence. People come to seek out what they should awaken inside. They accept punishments, empty rituals, sacred intermediaries, all because they have lost their connection with the sovereignty of the soul. The plan was simple and efficient: eliminate knowledge of past lives, cut the memory of the soul, and the human being becomes a mass of maneuver. After all, who fears the unknown obey, and those who do not remember their eternity lives as if it were disposable. But the time of fear is ending. More and more people are questioning, researching, awakening. And the most beautiful, that doesn't mean abandoning faith but rediscovering it. A faith that does not require kneeling before dogmas, but looking inside and remembering that you have always been more than they said. This is the great silent revolution of the century: souls waking up. And when this happens in mass, the control system begins to tremble. And now, after all this, what do you feel? Does that intuition you always had that your soul has gone through other lives, was it just imagination? Or would it be the soul's own memory, trying to remind you of who you really are? Perhaps you are just starting to wake up from a long dream, where they made you forget your origin, your strength, your eternity. But the most important question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge now? Will you continue accepting ready truths, or will you start looking for yours? The eternal soul that dwells in you carries answers. And it all starts with one-step question. Investigate, read the lost texts, explore what has been hidden. Do not accept limits imposed on fear, because your conscience was not born to be tamed, but to fly. If this content touched you in any way, if you have lit a spark inside, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. There is a lot more coming: stories, reflections, and revelations that can change their way of seeing life and, who knows, eternity.